after he died in 1778. In her first letter to him, so within a year of taking power, Catherine wrote in French, "I will respond to the prophecy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau by giving him a most rude refutation, I hope, for as long as I live." In the Social Contract from 1762, Rousseau disagreed with Voltaire's hopeful assessment of Russia's future in his recent work, The History of the Russian Empire under Peter the Great. Voltaire argued that Russia had been barbaric before Peter. For the French philosophes, however, a major problem was that over half of Russians were enslaved as serfs. Rousseau argued that there was no chance for progress in Russia because Peter the Great had crushed the desire for liberty, which had to develop naturally in the people. Europeans viewed Russian czars as tyrants, as Asiatic despots, never mind that Peter the Great had changed the title of Russia's autocrats from Tsar, which showed their connections with Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, and Eastern Orthodoxy, to emperor, thus turning to the Roman Empire and the West. Okay, next. In 1767, in a direct challenge to these largely negative opinions about Russia in Europe, Catherine opened her most influential work, The Great Instruction, written for the Legislative Commission which she convened to update the legal code, with the pronouncement that Russia is a European power. And by this she meant that she was a European monarch subject to natural laws rather than an absolute Asiatic despot, as Russia's critics maintained. Catherine borrowed extensively from her reading of the best and latest in European political thinking, especially Montesquieu and Beccaria. She published The Great Instruction as her Enlightenment calling card for all of Europe to read, in Russian and German parallel texts, and also in Russian, Latin, German, and French in one volume, and by 1780 in English, Dutch, Italian, Polish, and Greek translations. In her lifetime, the instruction went through 7 editions in Russian and 8 French editions, although it was banned in France. So if we look at this image, we can begin to try to understand how Catherine puts together the portraits for which she sat, and there are many portraits. So we see her writing a text, and if you look closely, it's a Russian text, although she wrote it originally in French. And you see a bust opposite her to inspire her, a bust of Peter the Great. She has 2 quill pens, and there are books, and on the side of the 2 books in the foreground, you can read that it's Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, one of the most important political treatises of the 18th century. To the left, there is an orb that represents her power. It's in the shape of a globe. And she's wearing an ermine cloak, which tells us that she's royalty. You can also see her initial E, Yekaterina, on the back of the chair. And there are Roman columns to indicate civilization and, most importantly, empire. How Catherine came to power also led to criticism of her and Russia abroad. So within days of her taking the throne, her husband, Emperor Peter III, was killed by a brother of her lover, Grigory Orlov, by whom she had given birth to an illegitimate son a mere 2 months earlier. The official reason given was death from hemorrhoidal colic. And so there was sniggering in letters in the Republic of Letters about how dangerous hemorrhoids were in Russia. Catherine's coup created 2 problems. First, for her legitimacy as a ruler, it's important to know that Catherine could have ruled legitimately if Elizabeth had named her as her successor. In 1722, Peter the Great issued a manifesto on succession that did away with primogeniture. He had actually had his son tortured to death a few years earlier, and so he wanted another way to anoint an heir and allow the emperor to name his successor man or woman. So, in letters at the time of her coup, Voltaire makes quite clear that the greater problem was that what the coup represented, which was the overall instability of Russia's government. There had been 4 previous coups between 1725 and 1741, all by women, including that of Empress Elizabeth. although Empress Catherine had named Elizabeth as a legitimate heir, but not her predecessor, Anna Ivanovna. So in Russia, Catherine's coup was the rule, not the exception, but abroad it undermined her credibility. It was hard to take Russia's rulers seriously if they were here one day and gone the next. In creating her public persona, Catherine everywhere addresses the two most important aspects of Russia's image in Europe: stability and enlightened rule. At the end of Catherine's reign, the French Revolution and the execution of Louis XVI in 1793 struck fear in the hearts of Europe's monarchs. She was afraid for Russia's stability after her death and may have tried unsuccessfully to bypass the succession of her son Paul in favor of her grandson Alexander. 5 years after her death, her worst fears were realized when Paul, hated as a tyrant, was murdered by Russian nobles. Her final memoir, written between 1794 and her death in 1796, indirectly responds to the future challenges to her legacy and to that of Russia. Because of the fundamental weakness of her position, combined with the extraordinary challenges she faced, Catherine's success depended on her political skills, her policies, and her personality. Catherine ended the arrests, torture, and exile of enemies under Elizabeth and carefully promoted and rewarded opponents. Like Elizabeth, Catherine depended for support on family clans, political factions, ministers' favorites, and the elite guards, who formed a complex network of alliances. Catherine was, above all, a working ruler. She got up at 6 a.m. to write and read, had a good memory for details, delegated well, and expected things to get done. Intelligent, well-read, energetic, and ambitious, Catherine, like Peter, applied herself to all aspects of Russian politics, society, history, and culture. Her life is a vast topic, and a new biography of her appears every few years, the latest by Peter Massey in 2011. For example, she bought over 2,600 paintings, including major collections intended for Frederick the Great. She liked the scoop, where you would get something that somebody else really wanted. The Brühl, Cruse, and Walpole collections, which caused a crisis in England at the thought of all these precious paintings leaving England for Russia. She bought more than any other buyer on the European art market in her lifetime, and not just paintings. She conducted 2 wars against the Ottoman Empire and 3 Polish partitions with Germany and Austria. By the time she died, she'd laid the groundwork for the modern Russian Empire and the state that lasted until the Russian Revolution in 1917. Now let's turn to some of the many portraits of Catherine, in which we can see some of the ways that she projected her right to rule and her might through painting. She had many copies made that were distributed at home and abroad, often as gifts. Abroad, Catherine projected an image of herself as European ruler of a European nation to convince the world of Russia's and her greatness. And at home, Catherine established her legitimacy by emphasizing her connections with Peter the Great, remember the bust, and his daughter, her predecessor, Empress Elizabeth. So after her coup in 1762, this equestrian portrait by the Swedish court painter Vigilius Eriksson was one of the first portraits as empress that Catherine had made of herself. Equestrian portraits in general convey nobility and status. The details of this portrait spoke to both her domestic and foreign audiences, and this is what Catherine wore for her coup. What detail of Catherine's uniform signifies the transfer of power from her husband Peter III, who's still alive at this point, to herself? So, how do you dress for success? The blue sash. So, the following is from the memoirs of the Princess Yekaterina Dashkova, who was at Catherine's side during her coup on June 28, 1762. And she was horrified to see that Catherine was not properly dressed for her coup. Again, we threw ourselves in each other's arms. No happiness could have exceeded mine at that moment. It had reached its summit. And suddenly I noticed that she was still wearing the Order of St. Catherine and had not yet put on the blue ribbon of the Cross of St. Andrew. The blue ribbon was not worn by the wife of the emperor. She was entitled only to the Order of St. Catherine, which had been founded by Peter I for his own wife. The Emperor Paul was the first to grant the blue ribbon to his wife, and Emperor Alexander followed his example in this respect. I ran to Mr. Panin to borrow his blue ribbon, which I put on the Empress's shoulder, and thereupon she took off her own insignia of the Order of St. Catherine and asked me to put them in my pocket. So the all-important detail here, in fact, is not the horse, but the blue sash. It signifies her transition from Grand Duchess to Empress. Okay, and so you guessed right. And next. Okay, and it signifies that indeed she is the ruler. Catherine's uniform is also important for two more reasons. It belongs to one of the elite guard regiments. Okay, the Semyonovsky Regiment, and it is green. Next. Okay. So one of the reasons for discontent with Peter III, Catherine's deposed husband, was his infatuation with the Prussian King Frederick the Great, which had led Peter to immediately end the 7-year war against Prussia on terms favorable to Prussia and to change the color of the uniforms of Russian soldiers to Prussian blue. Catherine was completely German, in contrast to Peter, who was Russian on his mother's side. His mother was Anna, the daughter of Peter the Great and sister of Elizabeth. That's why he was in Russia. But in wearing the old-style green uniform, Catherine was able to present herself as Russian. Unlike Peter, she learned Russian. We tend to associate Catherine with French and not German, which was her native language, in part because Catherine downplayed her German background, a crucial example of her savvy in shaping her social performance. Okay. And then in the background, you can see there are regiments, and you see St. Petersburg, and that's what she rules over. Okay, so next. Catherine's equestrian portrait is very unusual, but it served to connect her to equestrian images of the Empress Elizabeth, her predecessor, and thereby to assert her legitimacy as the new empress. So a Meissen statue here, Meissen was the elite porcelain for the royalty of Catherine on horseback, was meant to be paired with a similar statue of Elizabeth, and it's based on Elizabeth's equestrian portrait. She's wearing the blue sash and the star and everything to indicate that she is indeed the ruler. More striking, however, is Catherine's equestrian tribute to Peter the Great. In 1782, on the 100th anniversary of the beginning of Peter the Great's rule, Catherine unveiled an equestrian statue of Peter by the renowned French sculptor Etienne Falconet on an immense base called the Thunderstone, set in a square overlooking the Neva River in St. Petersburg, the city founded by Peter in 1703. Today, this statue is known as the Bronze Horseman, thanks to the famous poem about it by Pushkin. The inscription reads, "To Peter I from Catherine II." And this extraordinary sculpture simply bypasses Elizabeth entirely and created a direct link between Catherine and Peter on an immense stage. And so if you look at this setting, you see it's urban grandeur. There are multiple perspectives. You have this dynamic monumentality. You have the verticals, the horizontals, and then this kind of organic diagonal just coming up from the earth, it seems. Yes. Another important element in the theater of Catherine's reign was the insignia for chivalric orders. Here, too, she continued the legacy of Peter the Great. In 1699, after his return from his first trip to Europe, Peter the Great instituted Russia's first and highest chivalric order, the Order of St. Andrew, Russia's patron saint. This order was modeled on European chivalric orders such as the Order of the Garter in England, the Order of the Star in France, and the Order of the Golden Fleece in Burgundy. And so after establishing the Order of St. Andrew, which is that beautiful blue sash that you see on Russia's rulers, Peter the Great instituted the Order of St. Catherine for women in honor of his wife, Catherine I, and that's the beautiful red sash on Catherine when she arrives in Russia. And it's what she takes off in order to put on the blue sash. And orders signaled personal selection by the ruler, who then personally put the order insignia on the chosen nobleman or noblewoman. Order medals signaled rank and promotions, and knights were required to wear them for all formal occasions. Order accoutrements included sashes, stars, crosses, badges, necklaces, and special uniforms. And orders were thus integral to the performance of one's royal and noble identity. Like Peter, Catherine also instituted 2 new orders. In 1769, as she was conducting her first war against the Turks, she created the Order of St. George for military service, and in 1782, she created the Order of St. Vladimir for civil service. She gave both to herself, and later portraits show her wearing them with the Order of St. Andrew. Okay, so here we see Catherine again in the first order that she acquired, which was the only one in her time, so for women, the Order of St. Catherine. And it's significant that once Catherine took off her red sash and badge for the Order of St. Catherine during her coup and gave it to Princess Dashkova, she does not seem to have worn it for any portrait as empress, as if it belonged to her previous life. And of course, it would emphasize that she was the wife of the emperor in some way. And so look at this series of portraits now painted after Catherine became empress, and none of them do you see the red sash, but rather other insignia that signify either her status as ruler, her membership in orders, or both. So by Falconet, this is in Hillwood Museum in Washington, D.C. This museum is the largest collection of images of the royals and everything to do with them, because Marjorie Merriweather Post, who created this museum, her third husband, I believe, was the American ambassador to the Soviet Union in about 1932, 33, 34, just as the Soviets were selling off all things in their royal collections to raise money to buy tractors. And so she took advantage of this, and so it's an amazing museum for this kind of stuff, and also some incredible portraits. So there are lots of tchotchkes, so services and all kinds of things that have these insignia on them. Okay, so you see the Order of St. Andrew and the Order of St. George. You see the 2 stars, and they're always worn in the correct order of which comes first. So St. George is second to the Order of St. Andrew. Okay, and this is a portrait that she loved greatly and had many copies made of, and it was done for her Crimean Tour to the south, which took a half a year. And this is the tour from which we get the saying Potemkin villages. Prince Potemkin, who was, I believe, her 4th or 5th favorite, and possibly her husband, managed all her military affairs in the South. And so she went on tour not only to see everything, but of course to be seen. And so you see there the orders of St. Andrew, St. George, and then St. Vladimir underneath it. And this is a portrait that she loved because it showed her in a more kind of comfortable Russian type of clothing. And in this portrait, we can see that she's wearing the sashes for the orders, and they're all nicely layered in order. And she's got her ermine, of course. Okay, the next. And this is a full state regalia, and here she's wearing the diamond collar of the Order of St. Andrew, and then the Order of St. George also. This was a portrait that was made during the Second Russo-Turkish War, and it represents a gift that she made to the man who had arranged her financing for the war, the financier Henry Hope, who got her a large loan from the Dutch. So there are also portraits that are notable for the absence of chivalric orders, as Catherine strove for other ways to represent herself as the leader of her people, as Russian, and as a motherly, even grandmotherly figure in one of her favorite portraits. So here Catherine is wearing the kokoshnik, and it's a royal riff on peasant wear. And the next one. So this portrait is particularly striking in its juxtaposition of themes, since the grandmotherly Catherine is pointing to the Chesme column in the back, which commemorates the total destruction of the Turkish fleet in 1770. This was Russia's first great naval victory, which she celebrated with a memorial to Peter the Great, who had built Russia's navy. The top of the column has a Russian eagle with a Turkish crescent in its talons. So in the theater of power, Catherine never, ever forgets real power.
Let me just express with Hilde our thanks for all of you coming out this evening. I'm going to take us home, as it were, and it's utterly appropriate that I get less time because I'm not the expert on Catherine. I'm a French medievalist, as Bob said. I just happen to be very interested in Catherine, and because I work on French, I was able to help with the translation of the memoirs. For the remainder of this talk, let us turn to Catherine's memoirs of life at the Russian court. Though the idea that Catherine was a nymphomaniac is pure speculation, one thing is sure: she was a graphomaniac. That's a 50-cent word for someone who likes to write a lot. Catherine wrote on politics, Russian history, education, economics, and linguistics. She wrote thousands of letters, more than 24 plays and operas, the first Russian children's literature for her grandsons, and journalism. Fluent in Russian, French, and German, she published a good deal in Russian and abroad, in French and in translations, often anonymously. Oh, I wonder who wrote that, people would think. In this way, she promoted herself and Russia as enlightened. Secretly, she wrote about herself from the time she arrived in Russia in 1744 at the age of 14, until her death in 1796 at age 67. Once you understand how to read between the lines and interpret the details, these memoirs are riveting political thrillers. Yes, this is shameless self-promotion. This is trying to move product. I'm not going to apologize either. The memoirs are in fact not one, but 3 main documents in French, which she edited and revised, and they all cover her life before she became empress, with some significant differences that point to different overall narrative arcs. The main problem Catherine confronted as Grand Duchess in the Russian court was her political survival in the looming power struggle over a successor when Empress Elizabeth died. Catherine's allies wanted to put her on the throne, and failure meant exile or worse. The key to her survival was producing an heir. So that's the setup for the drama of the memoirs. Catherine wrote her first full memoir around 1756. It begins with her childhood and ends in 1754 with the birth of her first child, the heir to the throne, Paul, after 10 years of a marriage that was only consummated after 9 years. Catherine's tale of giving birth is one of neglect. When the child is born, he is taken away, and she has to make appointments to see him, because he is her source of power. In a letter, Catherine detailed her plan to go immediately to her son when Empress Elizabeth died. 20 years later, as Empress, Catherine writes her middle memoir in 3 parts in response to the publication of critical accounts of Russia and of Catherine's coup by the French writers Rudière and Chappe-d'Autroche. The middle memoir expands on her youth in Berlin at the court of Frederick the Great to counter the story that she was but a poor provincial relation, an emphasis on her German upbringing that she minimized in her first memoir and in her social presentation. She also indirectly addresses the threat to her legitimacy presented by the majority of her son Paul in 1772. So at this point, she's been empress for 10 years, when she was writing this memoir, and on the problems of Paul's inheritance of his father's lands in Holstein-Gottorp, which gave Paul an external power base. It takes some figuring out, but as she is advising Paul to give up Holstein for the glory of Russia, we hear both a mother speaking to her son and a brilliant and ruthless empress weakening a rival. Around 1794, Catherine began a final memoir, her fullest and longest, in 2 parts, which we translated. Our translation is the 4th and only the 2nd complete translation, since the last complete one in 1859, which was also the first one of Catherine's memoirs. This memoir begins with a maxim comparing Catherine and her deposed husband Peter III. It omits her childhood and youth and begins with her arrival in Russia. It is the professional memoir of a ruler, and her models were the recently published memoir of her competitor, Frederick the Great, and Plutarch's Lives, which contains instructive pairings of Roman and Greek leaders. The narrative arc of this last memoir is how Catherine survives the crisis in 1758, created by the arrest and exile of her ally, Chancellor Count Bestujev-Ryumin, Minister of Foreign Affairs, a crisis which forces Catherine to seek all means to see Elizabeth and persuade the Empress that Catherine is innocent of any intrigues. The key to this memoir, then, is access to the Empress Elizabeth, who isolates Catherine to limit Catherine's power, and who is isolated from Catherine by courtiers for the same reason. Among the reasons, then, that Catherine's memoirs are fascinating is that they are a first-hand account of the complexities of court life by a very observant, intelligent, and canny individual. The word court makes Catherine's testimony sound like it belongs to an archaic era, but what we must recall is that wherever there is power, there is some kind of court. Courts, in the broad sense, belong not only to earlier periods or noble societies, but to all times. One need only think of White House intrigues to see that courts continue even in modern democracies. So for this final section, let us look at a few of the ways that Catherine navigated this most treacherous terrain in which her reputation, liberty, and even life were at stake. One of the most prominent aspects of court culture across the centuries, and certainly in Catherine's memoirs, is the importance of generosity as a way of cultivating networks of supporters and strengthening one's position. So now we're going to read a little bit from the memoirs, and you get a sense for Catherine's voice in this final memoir. One day, when my mother and I were at the theater with the Grand Duke in a loge across from that of Her Imperial Majesty here is the Empress Elizabeth, I noticed that the Empress was speaking quite heatedly and angrily with Count Lestuc. When she had finished, Monsieur Lestuc left her and came to our loge. He approached me and said, "Did you see how the Empress was speaking to me?" I said, "Yes." "Well," he said, "she is quite angry with you." "With me? Why?" was my response. "Because," he said, "you have many debts. She says that one can empty wells, and that when she was a princess, she had no more support than you have and an entire household to maintain, and that she was careful not to indebt herself because she knew that no one would pay for her." He said all this dryly and with irritation, apparently so that she could see from her loge how he acquitted himself of his errand. I want you to notice here the gaze. The Empress is gazing over at Lestuc, who is performing the Empress's anger for Catherine, right? So again, the court is theater. Catherine continues, "As for me, I wanted to put my affairs in order immediately, and the next day I requested my accounts. They showed that I owed 17,000 rubles. Before leaving Moscow for Kiev, the Empress had sent me 15,000 rubles and a large coffer of simple cloths, but I had to be richly dressed. In sum, then, I owed 2,000 rubles. This did not seem to me an excessive amount. A variety of causes had forced these expenditures upon me. Primo, I had arrived in Russia very poorly outfitted. Though I had 3 or 4 outfits, I was at the end of the world, and at a court where one changed outfits 3 times a day. A dozen chemises made up all my lingerie. I used my mother's bed linens. Secondo, I had been told that they liked presents in Russia, and that with generosity one made friends and became likable. Tertio, the most spendthrift woman in Russia, Countess Rumyantseva, had been placed in my company. Always surrounded by merchants, she presented me daily with piles of things that she encouraged me to purchase from these vendors, things I often only bought to give to her because she craved them. The Grand Duke, so this is Catherine's husband now, the Grand Duke is the heir to the throne. The Grand Duke as well cost me a great deal because he was greedy for presents. My mother's ill humor was also easily pacified by things that pleased her, and as she was often then angry, and especially with me, I did not fail to use this method once I had discovered it. We will come back to the first point and focus on the second and third for now. Catherine writes, Secondo, with generosity one made friends and became likable. What this point highlights is that even though Catherine went to Russia at the Empress's invitation, and even though she was married to the imperial heir, this did not mean that she automatically had power. Rather, her power depended on her ability to make others feel obligated to her and on her ability to show that she could bestow gifts upon them, that she could, or eventually would, enrich them. It should also be noted that Catherine was in debt because Empress Elizabeth kept her on a very tight financial leash so as to limit Catherine's influence. Like Catherine, the Empress appreciated the power of gifts to build support. Catherine's third point is also crucial to understanding the role of gifts at court, because it shows that gift-giving was not just about keeping underlings and acquaintances happy, but also one's intimates. Catherine mentions Countess Rumyantseva, who had been placed in her company to manage her entourage, and in truth, to spy on Catherine on behalf of the Empress. Catherine at all costs had to keep this woman happy. Otherwise, she would have jeopardized her position at court and that of her mother. Next, Catherine mentions the Grand Duke, who was her husband, and her mother, both of whom she pacified with presents. In the court, everyone, from servants to spouses to parents, was a potential ally or enemy, and gifts were a way to maintain loyalty and good relations. However, gifts could also be a way to show disdain or lack of consideration. After Catherine has her first child, the Empress Elizabeth gives her what Catherine describes as, quote, a very poor little necklace with earrings and 2 pitiful rings that I would have been ashamed to give to my ladies in waiting, unquote. This paltry gift, together with the court's virtual abandonment of Catherine in her postpartum state, was a way of isolating and demoralizing her. When we examine the material culture of the court, we need to recall Catherine's words. She reminds us that many courtly objects were intended as gifts, and are therefore significant not only for their aesthetic qualities, but also for what they tell us about the social dynamics of the era in question. Another enduring aspect of court culture is the need for nobles to be charming and pleasing, and thereby exhibit their superior inner qualities. Catherine makes it clear that a favorable impression depends, to a great extent, on clothing. She writes, it must be admitted that at that time the cultivation of coquetry was an important part of court life, and there was competition to see whose finery would be the most elegant. I remember that one day at one of these public masquerades, after learning that everyone was having the most beautiful new outfits made, and despairing of surpassing the other women, I decided to put on a bodice of white gros de tour and a skirt of the same material over a very small hoop. At the time, I had a very thin waist. I had my hair arranged as best I could in front. In back, I had my hair, which was very long, very thick and quite beautiful, curled, and I had it tied with a white ribbon and a ponytail. I had a single rose whose bud and leaves perfectly resembled the real thing placed in my hair. I attached another to my bodice. I put a ruff of very white gauze around my neck, put on cuffs and a little apron of the same gauze, and I went to the balls. As I entered, I clearly saw that all eyes were fixed on me. Without stopping, I crossed the gallery and went into the facing apartment. I met the Empress, who said to me, "Good God, what modesty! What, not even a beauty spot?" I began to laugh and replied that it was for simplicity's sake. She pulled her box of beauty spots from her pocket and chose one of medium size, which she applied to my face. Parenthetical comment, there are actually cultural histories of the beauty spot that have been written by 18th century scholars. Quite fascinating topic. Even beauty spots are very, very important in the theater of the court. Upon leaving her, I went very quickly into the gallery, where I showed my beauty spot to my intimates. I did the same with the Empress's favorite ladies, and as I was in high spirits, that evening I danced more than usual. In my life, I do not recall having had so much praise from everyone as on that day. They said that I was very beautiful and particularly radiant. To tell the truth, I have never believed myself to be extremely beautiful, but I know how to please, and I think that this was my forte. I'm going to skip ahead to our conclusion now. There are numerous other phenomena associated with courtly culture that receive extensive and vivid representation in Katherine's memoirs: gossip, slander, spying and eavesdropping, the demonstration of piety, the itinerant lifestyle, dance, equitation. I will conclude with what I think is the most important aspect of court life, whether we are talking about Egyptian pharaohs, Russian empresses, or American presidents, and that is the control of access and proximity to the ruler. If there is one dominant theme in Katherine's, as in all court and political memoirs, it is the machinations by which various individuals and factions seek to limit and orchestrate the ruler's contacts, and the writer's attempts to overcome these obstacles. In Katherine's case, the stakes, as we have said, could not have been higher. She risked enclosure in a convent, exile, or even death if she was not able to sway the Empress and through her acquire real authority. But for most of the memoirs, Katherine has very little contact with the Empress, and most of it is negative. Things come to a head toward the end of the memoirs when Katherine, exhausted by giving birth a second time, utterly isolated and terrified because her allies at court have been arrested and because she risks the same fate, decides she must see the Empress at any cost to plead her case directly. Unable to arrange a face-to-face meeting, she is aided by a sympathetic servant and her own resourcefulness. And what Katherine does is, she has this lady-in-waiting's uncle, who is both Katherine's confessor and the Empress's confessor, come to her at night because Katherine claims that she is seriously ill and afraid that she is dying. In other words, what Katherine does in this moment, when she absolutely must have access to the Empress, is she puts on a play. She pretends that she is dying. The confessor comes to see Katherine. Katherine expresses all of her anxiety to the confessor. He then goes directly to the Empress and is able to tell the Empress in Katherine's own words what Katherine is thinking, how she's feeling, and why she needs to see the Empress. It's an extraordinary moment that really shows Katherine's court savvy. Direct access to the Empress is crucial at this juncture, yet it is not easy for Katherine to get, and even harder for her to get it on her own terms without people knowing about it. Nonetheless, Katherine finds an excellent way, trustworthy, quiet, to get through to the Empress directly. As Katherine writes, the confessor should be sent for so that he would be able to tell Her Imperial Majesty what he heard from my own mouth. This episode brings together many aspects of court life. Generosity, since the servant who helps Katherine is presumably well disposed toward her because of her kindness and gifts. It also evokes the importance of direct oral communication and access. It evokes the importance of religion and pious display, and it exhibits the slander under which Katherine suffers. But this episode is perhaps most striking because of its theatricality. Katherine plays at dying to avoid a fate that could be equally dire. Moreover, as this episode shows, theatrical does not mean empty. Rather, theatricality is a requirement of court life because it is only when words and actions are wrapped in particular forms that they have meaning and influence in court. As the memoirs make clear time and again, Catherine had a keen understanding of the power of spectacle on both the intimate and grand scales. Catherine mastered all the modes of expression and all the signs of the court, from gifts to dress to horseback riding to the well-timed gesture to extravagant banquets, and eventually dominated this court and the nation it represented completely. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Oh, yes, she did.
Is that normal back then?
I don't know. She did. I don't know it offhand. I'm sorry, that you, this lady read somewhere that Catherine wrote her own epitaph and was this common. And I don't know if it was common, but yes, she did write her own epitaph. Yes?
It says there, Grand Duchess Ekaterina Alexeyevna was born 1716.
No, those are the dates for the artist.
Oh,
Sorry about that. Questions? Any questions about Catherine in general? I mean, we had a topic. Yes, please.
Was she educated in Germany?
She was educated from a very young age in German and French because she was destined for the international European marriage market. That's what you did if you were from a poor German noble family. So this is for her to aspire to a marriage with the heir to the Russian throne was at the end of the spectrum of incredible luck in her life. And so she had a tutor. She had tutors, and so she was educated at home, which was the best education that you could get at the time. Yes.
Was she scrutinized for being a more Western power in Russia, for Westernizing in Russia?
Yes, so was Catherine scrutinized because she was a Westerner in Russia? So was her life difficult at the court because people thought that she was full of herself, maybe, right, as a Westerner? She doesn't really, well, she has some choice comments about the Russian court. She wrote that, for example, she thought that she and Princess Dashkova were two of the only women who read at the court. To her, it seemed the court was backwards in many ways, certainly compared with the courts that she was familiar with in Germany. But of course, there aren't that many comments that you can find along this line because that isn't really how she wanted to present herself. Yes?
Was Catherine's eye for reputation and power projection infrequent for that time, or was she just better at it than everyone else who tried?
Oh, no, everybody did this. Frederick the Great. Oh, Catherine could try to compete with Frederick in all the wonderful things, all his wonderful accomplishments. And the one thing she couldn't do as a writer was write poetry. And she tried, but she just couldn't learn it. There was Frederick the Great playing his flute and writing his flute sonatas. She couldn't do that. These were all ways to show your nobility, your education, your refinement. And so this was simply she had a stage from which to do this, though, that was unparalleled. Yes?
It's a question for Mark.
Oh.
Sorry. So I think you mentioned that there are like 2,000 plays that she wrote and operas.
She wrote about 24 plays and operas.
Oh, I misunderstood. What happened to them?
Oh, they all exist. I have them in my office. Some of them have been translated into English. I've taught them at ASU in my drama class, and they're very witty. Yes.
Is there any written record of what happened when she finally did get to see the Empress?
Oh, we have
After the
Yes, we have the record of her conversations. There are, in fact, 2 conversations at the end of the last memoir, and every conversation, every interaction with the Empress is noted. So the business with the beauty spot, that's what you call in journalism a get. She was able to get her FaceTime with the ruler, and so she does record her conversations in these last 2 really important conversations that helped her weather the last 3 years before Elizabeth died.
Thank you.
Yes.
Was her first child by her husband, or was that also illegitimate?
Here we come to what the question is: was her first child by her husband, or was it by her lover? The marriage was unconsummated for 8 or 9 years, partly because Peter III, it was discovered, had problems having an erection and he needed to be circumcised. And so at that point, they apparently had conjugal relations. But Elizabeth also came up with another unusual way to get the couple going, as it were, and she assigned each mistress, each lovers. And Catherine was able to choose, and she was able to choose, and we're given the initials, but we know who the names stand for. She could choose between Lev Naryshkin or Sergei Saltykov. And it's not just that these were 2 of the hunkiest guys at court, but they were the scions of the most important noble families. The Naryshkins and the Saltykovs had married into the Tsar's families, and so Peter the Great's mother was a Naryshkin, and his half-brother had married a Saltykov. So this was an unorthodox solution, but it was a very good solution. And so she chose Sergei Saltykov, and Peter III got the wife of she was now the widow of the court painter Growth, who did the wonderful portrait of Catherine in the yellow dress with the ribbon. And I believe that it was that Paul was the child of her lover Sergei Saltykov, because Peter had other affairs, and at the time when he became emperor, he was having an affair with Princess Dashkova's sister. So the sisters were from the Vorontsov family, a very powerful family, and they were playing both sides of the power struggle between Dashkova and her sister. And so, but he never had a child by any of his mistresses, whereas Catherine had 3 children. The second, a daughter by Poniatowski, who became the King of Poland, and then the third by Grigory Orlov. And the third child lived as Babrinsky until 1813, and that was also a problem for her, because the Orlovs tried to leverage that child into forcing her to marry Grigory Orlov so that they would be able to have a share of power, and she refused to do that. While this was all being negotiated, they didn't name the child, so those are the records that we have of this.
And another thing that's worth pointing out is that the Romanovs themselves were clearly very bothered by the possibility that they were themselves illegitimate, because in the 1907 Russian imperial edition of Catherine's memoirs, the passages relating to her taking on the lovers and doubts about, or passages that could raise possible doubts about the paternity of her son, who's going to become Paul IV, are excised. That's 1907, that's 10 years before the Russian Revolution, the Tsars are still in power, so they wanted to keep this out of the public mind. And so what we did was we went back and we restored those passages to the memoirs. So those are in our translation.
Those passages have never been actually printed from the manuscripts, so we have that in an appendix to our translation. Yes?
I was going to say, could you share some experience how long were you there looking through the archives, and do you have some memorable event that stood out?
Yes, Mark can tell you a lovely story about working in Russian archives.
I'm sorry, this is for the archive geeks. Normally when you go into an archive that has precious manuscripts in it, there will be air conditioning, all the windows and doors will be sealed, you must take notes in pencil, you're not allowed to bring any food in, and everything is very tightly controlled. You have to wear gloves. The lighting is well overhead to prevent there being any heat exposure to any of the objects. So when you walk into the pre-1800 archive regatta in Moscow, you walk up to the conservator's desk, and the first thing that you see is a cat laying on the counter next to piles of manuscripts from the 17th and 18th centuries that are all in paper, and the bindings of which are about that thick. These are incredibly thickly bound books, and that's not very healthy from a codicological perspective. And then when you take your manuscript, you go to a little table in a room where there's no air conditioning, where the casements for the windows are all rotting. The windows are thrown wide open. People are drinking water, chewing gum, taking notes in pen. And there are these little lamps that were about this high off the table, producing tremendous heat out of their bulbs. And the books are this thick, so they're only about 3 inches below the light bulbs, and they're flipping through these moldering pages. And then, so we walk into this, and they just hand us Katherine's manuscript. Right? And this is extraordinary. Even for someone who works with medieval manuscripts, this is by far the most precious object I will ever touch, written in her hand over all of these decades. And so and at the end, we can't knock them because they were very generous. They let us look at this in the flesh and work with it. And it was moving. It was truly extraordinary.
And are they still open? I've heard
Yes.
that they closed sometimes. Are they still open for scholars?
Oh, when you go there, it's always a risk that you take that the archives are closed or open. And so we were there for 2 weeks to work with these documents. And so I was nervous the whole time. And I'm so glad that we were able to see everything that we needed to see.
They don't have copy machines, do they, or did they?
Oh,
Or did you
sure
take
there
your
are
own
sure there are copy machines. Yes, and of course now you can work with computers and you can take photographs. So.
I promised the store to end this at about 10 after 8. W.C. Fields wrote his own epitaph. It says, "I think I'd rather be in Philly." He hated Philly. Yeah. Let's thank our speakers. For coming once again. Refreshments over here. We can continue the discussion. If you've enjoyed this, come back and please consider donating to the center.
Okay, thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. I need a favor for you before you run off. The chair that you were sitting on, if you can please grab that chair, carefully fold it up and place it either against history, mystery, or this wall here. Be doing us a great big favor. Thank you very much.
Oh,